All right, thanks everyone for coming. It's the 4 o'clock session called Countering Identity Creep, because most talks need buzzwords in the title. Thank you for coming here and spending time on a Sunday. 2 hours ago I was on a duck boat, so I feel you. Truthfully was with my kids and stuff. So my name is Ben Johnson. I'm CTO and co-founder of Obsidian, and let's just dive right in. I'll get into my background a little bit too. So just want to give you a little bit of who I am and where I'm coming from, talk a little bit more about state of cyber. Then, of course, central to this whole conference, talk more about identity, and then go into some ways maybe we can reduce the fact that everyone has way too much identity and access. And then maybe just sort of wrap it up and get into Q&A. I know it's the last talk in this track, so if there isn't good discussion, maybe we get out of here early, but I would stay all night if we have good discussion. So I encourage questions at the end and discussion. And thanks to Sarah and to the organizers for having me. So real quick, got my start at NSA, spent time working for NSA, CIA, and DoD. It was awesome stuff. I would have done it for free, and they paid us, so that was pretty cool. Ended up co-founding a company called Carbon Black, next generation endpoint security company. That was a wild ride. I spoke to about 700 organizations around the world. I was the field-facing CTO for that. And then I got tired because it was kind of too big, and I'm more of a startup guy, so helped start Obsidian. We're located in beautiful Southern California, Newport Beach. That's why I have some pictures of beaches and things like that. I love startups as well, so I'm a bunch of startup boards. And so I always put a slide like this in where I talk about the goal, and really the goal is to get you to reflect, get you to contemplate, get you to think. Sounds maybe a little vague, but I know when I go to conferences or go listen to someone speak, it's really the time away from the email and all the other stuff. It's the time to actually think, maybe a little more strategically, or maybe just pick a couple tips and you walk out with like 1 or 2 things you're gonna go try. So I hope this helps you in that way. So state of cyber, we all see the headlines, probably sick of it. There's really becoming breach fatigue. We all see too many breaches. We sort of get desensitized, and even the average citizen, I think, for the most part, is a little bit desensitized because there's so many breaches, and it's not really hitting them in the wallet. They still probably have their job, that kind of thing. But you know, it is getting worse and worse. You're seeing on the left, it's just more recent, but on the right, it's a timeline from several years ago to recent times, and you can see it's exploding. And again, it's almost silly to talk to an audience like this about it, but we need to keep in mind that this is getting worse. And when you start thinking about things like cloud, to play on words, it's leaky, right? Like there's a lot of open S3 buckets and open access that the adversaries are taking advantage of. And it's just, sometimes not even an adversary, it's just our mistakes. And one thing I was gonna say, and I forgot to say it, if you're in the previous talk, this talk will not be as in the weeds. They were very, that talk was very technical. This is more kind of thought-provoking and high level, so maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. But there are plenty of challenges with cyber. So in my travels, sadly, I did 100 flights a year for the last 4 years. These are the things that I noticed the most. So skills gap, there's just not enough good butts in seats. Whether it's a failure of the HR system, whether it's a failure of the talent pool, whatever it is, there's not enough people doing security, doing cyber defense. And then the second one that you may or may not have thought about, but there's this huge problem called deploy and decay. You set up your tech stack, you set up your defenses, but they actually get worse over time rather than better. The adversaries change, the environment changes, you need new rules. You don't have enough people to do constant care and feeding. Data is exploding, call it huge data, call it whatever you want, but it's all over the place. And then the adversaries are having success. So that breeds, like any market, that breeds competition. They're not going away. They're getting paid. And all of this really, you roll it up, and teams don't have a lot of self-esteem. Now it sounds kind of maybe cheesy, but we need that after-school special of Big Bird telling us we can actually do it. But it's true, you talk to CISOs or CIOs and they don't have a lot of confidence in their team. You talk to the team, they don't have a lot of confidence in the executive staff or the culture. And so it's not a pretty picture. And so when you start thinking about adversaries, you need to think that they have different motivations and they act in different ways. So you got cyber criminals, hacktivists, nation states, and insiders. So you got the cyber criminals trying to usually make some sort of financial gain. You got hacktivists who are usually trying to make a point. You got nation states who may be doing all sorts of things, but usually more strategic, more politically motivated. And then insiders. And the reason I really talk about this slide is for one reason, and it's the last column there. It's insiders. All three of the first groups, what are they after? They're after access. They're after credentials. They want to become insiders. So if you don't think about how you can detect insider threat, I guarantee you, you cannot detect nation states. You cannot detect sophisticated cyber criminals. So we'll come back to that. So are we healthy? Are all of your organizations healthy? Well, I was watching a TED Talk, and there was a great quote. The absence of disease does not mean health. But how many people, if you haven't been breached in the last couple years, probably your executives or your board thinks you're healthy? I would say most people would raise their hands, but just because you haven't been in a headline doesn't mean things are good. So, what's going on? Well, first of all, there's this huge disconnect. IT is really focused on authentication, authorization, enablement, provisioning, really providing access. And then security is supposed to do threat management or anomaly detection, that kind of thing. And there's really not a good connection. Some organizations, I'll give it to you, there's a great connection. Maybe it's even the same person, which probably has its own problems. But a lot of organizations, they're very disconnected. You give all the access over here, and then these people have to watch and see what the hell's going on. And they might even be geographically distanced, that kind of thing. And there's this race to the cloud, right? I think there were so many like Dilbert comics when I searched for cloud, but it's just crazy how fast people are moving. And don't just take my word for it. I'm a big quote guy. IT is leaving security in the dust. Or we're blind to all these new SaaS accounts. People just spin up and spin down things. Security has no idea. Talk to companies, some of the best brands in the world have 400 AWS accounts with no governance. 400 AWS accounts. I'll come back to that as well. And then the CISO of Cisco said this the other day. He said, hackers don't break in, they log in. So you combine this with, really this new modern enterprise is complicated. You got SaaS, you got IaaS, you got platform as a service, you got private data centers, you still have on-prem unless you're a tiny little startup. And even with something like SaaS, where you have the least amount of responsibility, you're responsible for who has access. So I think you can see a theme here. So, with that, back to identity. So we start thinking about the cloud, we start thinking about IT, InfoSec in the cloud. Really, I just took things out of Wikipedia and then trimmed a sentence or two. But IT is really about managing, processing information. And then security is about making sure it's not used in an unauthorized matter. But then you're trying to do that against shared resources, against ubiquitous access, against systems that are on 365 days a year and can be accessed globally. And you don't have low-level access to truly tune it. So that's becoming tricky. And so really, and I think we probably need a new word here, other than perimeter, maybe gatekeeper, maybe you guys have some suggestions. But really, it used to be about defending the network. You had control over the assets, you knew what network they were on. And then you saw this explosion in endpoint, and that's where I just came from the last 7 years, where it's like, okay, our users are going to work from coffee shops, they're going to go to conferences, they're going to bring their laptop, they're going to access our data. So it needs to be more about endpoint security, so you at least control that asset. But now, with all of the back-end services moving more and more to cloud, and then all of you presumably accessing things like email, even things like Salesforce, et cetera, from your phone, from your tablet, things that IT doesn't really have control over, the only thing you can do is try to manage access. You don't have control over the devices people are using. and you don't own the infrastructure that they're connecting to. So you must manage access. So don't just listen to me. Think about things like Azure or AWS. I got 2 slides here. So even with SaaS, you have to handle identity and things like what data's on there. And that's what the bad guys want. They want your data or they want your identity. With your identity, they can spread, or they can spin up new instances and mine whatever new coin comes out, right? And same with Azure, you're responsible for a lot of the security, even though it's their infrastructure. So we can't forget all of this stuff. So just to summarize it a little bit, SaaS provider, Slack, Office 365, Salesforce, whatever, they handle everything except identity and access management and what devices are being used, that kind of thing. That's all on you. That's on me. That's on all of us. So to think about it a little bit differently, Office 365, yeah, you're not responsible for patching the underlying operating systems and worrying about that infrastructure, but you're responsible for what is emailed, who accesses the email, and then how they access the email. That's on you or your IT team, your security team, depending on how you spread it out. So, talking about identity creep. And we're going fast because I know it's Sunday afternoon. So, everyone in this room, I guarantee you, has environments where there's dormant accounts, mismatched permissions, overprivileged users, because I have a 30-person startup and we have them. So if we have them, and some of you probably work for organizations with 100,000 employees, you have plenty of creep. You probably can't see that, but what I did is I wrote a little script that connects to AWS and just dumps the last time people have logged in with their IAM role. And my CEO, Glenn, has not logged in for 238 days. I think I'm on there at like 87 days. But the point is, we have people with access that probably no longer need it. So you could say that's creep. The other thing is, it's a pain in the ass sometimes to think about privilege. So you probably can't read that from where you're sitting. Maybe you can. The bottom screenshot is, again, we probably have about 20 AWS users in our company of 30 people. I dumped the account authorization details from AWS into a JSON file. It's 20,758 lines. And we're not doing anything crazy whatsoever. 20,000 lines. I started looking at it and I had no idea what was going on. So it's tough. So you start thinking about your surface area. All of this is surface area. Can you start visualizing your granted surface area versus your used surface area? I guarantee you it's going to look something like this. It might even be worse. You're going to see people with lots of accounts or at least privileges that they don't use. Someone was telling me the other day, one of their people came to them and said, hey, I need write access to production. And they were like, wait a minute, you have read access? So it's a crazy problem, you know? But can you at least start visualizing and seeing how bad of a problem it is? We need to right-size that surface area. So it's not just about risk. I'm more concerned with risk. You're probably more concerned with risk. I know we have a variety of backgrounds. But talking to this 500-employee company, or 600-employee company, just looking at 3 of their services, 3, Duo, Office 365, and Salesforce, all great products. When you look at granted versus active and break it down into cost, this company, 600 people, that's not big. They could save over 300 grand a year. That's depending on salaries and stuff, that's a couple head count, right? And you talk to the security team and they're like, they hate it there because they can't get head count. Well, here's 2 head count right there. So yes, I focus more on risk and think more about security and that kind of thing, but maybe there's a cost savings here. In fact, I know there is. So talking about hybrid, I'm not going to try to throw the hybrid term in here much other than the title, because the problems are basically the same. Whether you're looking at SaaS, IaaS, on-prem things like Active Directory, it's messy. So I just want to throw this in here that these problems are not specific to something like Salesforce or Office 365. Now, those are maybe a little bit easier to get creep because they're so easy to sign up. I talked to a major airline and they had 16 different Slack teams and they don't even allow Slack. And that's all they knew about. It's crazy because it's so easy. Any one of you can go sign up and you can get just enough access and you can probably charge it on your company card because it's below a threshold. And now you have all these accounts and all this access. So, what can we do? Well, it's not going to be easy, but here's some thoughts. And then I'd love to have some discussion if there's any discussion. So, first of all, we have to step back, and if anyone here is old enough and has worked in security or IT for a long time, there was this notion of AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, there's a ton of stuff when you talk about identity, and probably this conference, right? A lot of the talks are around rethinking authentication or identity verification. That's great. Biometrics, MFA, YubiKeys, whatever. That's awesome. But that's not the whole picture. Remember how we talked about all of those groups want to become insiders? Or you maybe actually have insider threats? I mean, I think Tesla's dealing with that right now. You have to think about authorization and accounting. Do people have the right access? Even if it is Joe or Bob or Jack or whomever, does that person have the right access? And then what are they doing with it? Accounting. What are they actually doing with it? And then thinking about all of this as a life cycle. Now, we all work in tech, we all work in security or IT. So we're used to life cycle slides. But the whole point is provision doesn't have to be day one of the employee showing up, and deprovision doesn't have to be day 1,000 or whenever they leave. It can be much more dynamic than that. But you also have to monitor what people are doing in between there. Most people, and I bet a lot of people in here, most people, they would said, once people log in, I have no idea what they do. So we got to start thinking about that. So, thinking about visibility. And if you see the slides, maybe it's easier to read than here. But all I did for these was, first of all, you just need to think about like who's interacting with whom and what's your surface area. That's the upper left. But then over towards the right, I think the first one is a screenshot of Slack. They have some reports you can generate for how many people are sharing files externally and internally and things like that, and how many messages and private messages and things like that people are sending. And then on the right, Google actually, it's not super rich and verbose, but if you use G Suite, they actually tell you like how many external links you have where the public can access shared files or things like that. So you can actually at least start to understand how bad of a problem this is. And down here on the left, you can see things like these are guest accounts that I've invited into my Slack team, or how many people are active, because that's really where you want to try to reduce the number of dormant or orphaned accounts. And then of course things like who's logging in and where they're logging in from. This stuff's available. The problem is, who owns most of this stuff? IT. Who probably wants to use it a lot of the time? Security. So again, remember that disconnect? That makes it hard. So can you at least start maybe pulling logs, centralizing them, throwing them in a data lake, pick your tool of choice. But a lot of these have APIs, or at least someone could run a job and dump some of this stuff. You consume it, you share it. It's good information both for IT and security. So can you start with visibility? The other thing is, and I don't know if I've heard this before, but we're saying it, provision and forget. We got to stop doing that. Sort of like deploy and decay. We got to stop provisioning and forget. So rather than someone walking in on day one and you just give them all this stuff, because you gave the last new hire all that stuff, you give them what they need. And then maybe they need QuickBooks or Zoom. So you add that one account. And then you actually remove it when they don't need it, instead of just adding and adding and adding. It's a process change. It's a thought change, like a behavioral change. So rather than just them just getting everything, try to keep it much tighter. But it starts with just thinking about it. Can I implement this in my organization? Now, that's great, and you're probably saying that is great, but I already have a problem, or at least you, Ben, are telling me I have a problem. Well, and again, we're trying to make up buzzwords here, I think, but can you do some pruning? And the whole goal is, can you take away stuff and people are still productive? Can you reduce access or take accounts away completely and they still are as productive? So you need to try to trim where you can, try to shrink that extra surface area. And do it, if you need to do it a little bit at a time, that's okay. But you can only do this if you get better at provisioning. So you can't take things away if you don't have a good process for adding them back. This isn't just about identity and access. This is about things like website access, application control, whitelisting, etc. Those are huge success stories in organizations, but they're only success stories when the exception process for the employee is easy. So for example, just lock down, if you have a lot of people at a headquarters, lock down and only allow the top 1,000 or 5,000 websites to be accessed. Most people won't care because that's their news site or whatever, their Gmail, whatever. But if they do need something extra, you have to have a good process. Same with application control. There's a lot of whitelisting products, et cetera, for laptops, for endpoints, et cetera. That only works if there's a good process. If it's really hard to get something to run that's blocked by default, people are going to be up in arms. So it's the same thing when you talk about accounts, entitlements, privilege. Take them away, but make it really easy to add them back. Otherwise, you're going to have kind of a big fire on your hands. But instead of things like people have to sign off and all this, if you're starting to do monitoring, if you're starting to have good visibility, you should have more trust that the person needs it. And guess what? If they don't, or if they're misusing it, and you have actual monitoring and visibility, then you're okay. So make it quicker, make it easier. And again, then you can start to prune, you can start to reduce privilege and take things away. The other thing is, and I'm sure no one in this room has this problem, you need to know who's sponsoring either a contract account or a bot, automated service account. Because how many times is there a service account and no one knows why the hell it exists or who the hell owns it? Same with a contractor. Does this contractor actually need these privileges? Who's the actual sponsor for that? We really need to involve more of the business in understanding access. Everyone needs to help out. Everyone needs to be a sponsor for either a service account or contractor account, and even things like maybe a manager is a sponsor for their employee's account. The other thing is, if we start down this path and we can start to compare teammates against each other, it should be pretty easy to understand where some quick wins are. Hey, no one else on this team has this, access, Salesforce or whatever. I guess here it's G Suite. Okay, maybe that's a great thing to take away. And then can we get to a place where you can request access? Maybe it's a Slack bot or it's some other system. But if you can start to work on that, you're going to have a lot better opportunity to, again, reduce privilege. If people can get accounts they need quickly, they're much more willing to allow you to take them away. So, takeaways. I'm going to step back for a second. I hope this isn't confusing. But I've learned a lot talking to probably close to 800 different enterprises now. So I want to start with security, and then I'll dive a little bit more into specifically some of this stuff. So first of all, and the reason I'm doing that is because I think a lot of this stuff applies to things like identity and creep and that kind of stuff. The best security out there, the best teams, approach everything as an engineering problem versus an analysis problem. If you're just hiring people to look at data and look at reports and it's trying to think of it as like an intelligence or an analysis problem, you're probably not going to be as good as if you look at it like an engineering problem. Can I solve this through code, or can I tie different technologies together? Can I rethink process? Remember that different groups have different incentives, different perspectives, different goals, different risks. People on the left need to build something great, but they don't have to be the ones that sit in it. And so I was actually fortunate to, the guy in the lower right, Captain James Weatherby, I was actually at 2 different conferences where he spoke, and I got to hang out with him. He's just fantastic. He goes and speaks to companies, so I recommend hiring him, by the way. But he said he spent a lot of time making sure the people on the left felt a human connection to him. Maybe tighten that bolt a little more, knowing that Jim's my buddy, right? Going up in this thing. But the point is, in your organization, different people have different concerns. Marketing wants to get the number of leads up. Sales wants to close the deal. IT wants to make sure they're not preventing what they think is, productivity stopping. And so you have to think about all that. The other thing is, and we're kind of talking about this throughout the talk, reduce entropy. Like, your environment probably looks like the left-hand picture. And that's not, I mean no offense by that. I just have not met many environments that look like the right. And even in the real world, I've sat in the left, I've never sat in the right. So we got to think about how can we clean things up, reduce entropy. And I actually think cloud and this migration to cloud is a huge opportunity. You're actually seeing the unification. People that are focused on different things are having to do, people that are typically siloed have to focus on doing more of sort of the end-to-end management of these systems. And so really, what is it? IT wants to provide appropriate technology, and security wants to provide appropriate risk. So can we come together in those? So giving you 5 InfoSec tips, and then I think I have a couple more tips. So approach security or risk management as an engineering problem. Can you think about fixing provision and forget and deploy and decay? Both of those have the same problem. You do something, and then you sort of forget about it, or you don't give it the care and feeding it needs. And that's going to take some democratization. Can you spread it out where other people are helping you? Can you actually treat your users as smart? I think this is actually a big trend going on in the industry now, where instead of all of us that work more in security thinking of everyone else in the company as dumb when it comes to cyber and risk, can we start to sort of enable that National Guard and say, you know what, everyone can help a little bit. We mentioned reduce entropy, reduce risk. IT and security really need to be tightly coupled. Make it fun. Make it especially fun for the people that have to do it all the time. Get some quick wins, celebrate those. Don't always just be overwhelmed. Like, celebrate that you detected something bad or you really improved something. Take away a bunch of accounts and no one complains, and then go have a party and say, yes, we reduced risk. So countering creep. So first of all, and I don't really get much pushback when I say identity creep exists, because I think everyone feels it. Everyone knows they have accounts right now that they don't use. But at least accept that it exists, and either it's adding cost or adding risk or both. And that risk, like, do you really want this account that should have been shut off to be the reason you're on, Wall Street Journal or Washington Post or whatever, or on Krebs? Technology, there's a whole bunch of stuff we could list here, but really, can you just centralize some of this data? I showed you a few screenshots. I think the slides will be available. If not, you can contact me. But you can go into all these different applications and get some pretty good reports, and they're improving like month over month, or at least every few months there's more reporting and more security built into these products. But a lot of the things I hope you take away are more process-centric. So can you make provisioning easy? Because if you don't, as we talked about, it's going to be really hard to take people's access away. And then once provisioning is easy, or at least not too painful, we'll say, can you prune that existing access? And then more strategically, can you set up the process so when people join, they almost have zero access? Like, welcome, here's a computer, you have no access, tell us what you need. And it's more on demand. And some of this you can do as sort of use it or lose it, but you have to be a little bit smarter, because users will catch on and they'll just log into Salesforce every 6 months just for 5 minutes and think, okay, that's enough. But if they're not actually doing something, like, you need to be able to say, you know what, you don't actually use it. But the whole point is if provisioning's easy and people know that, they'll be okay with it. And then a lot of this rolls up to people. Can people be more involved? Can they help tell you what they actually need to do their job? And can they buy into the fact that they're gonna lose access, but they can get it back if they need it? Questions? And I can't really see anything because there's like bright lights right here.
Hello, hello?
Hi.
Check 1, 2.
Hi. So I think the identity or the access creep is a real problem in the industry. I mean, I do appreciate it. But the concept wherein the zero access, I mean, while it is the ideal kind of state that any organization would want to achieve, when you talk about simplistic examples of SaaS-based applications, I think this concept could lend well. But talk about the enterprise. So, I mean, do you recommend this to be a end state, or do you talk about more layered approach, wherein this state cannot be possible for certain scenarios, wherein you talk about the administrators coming in every day and they need same type of access. It is not practical to really provision that access on a daily basis, for example, or the access needs could be quite complex. So, I mean, so how do you see industry addressing the real on-the-ground issues in a more layered fashion rather than trying to achieve the ideal state? Thank
Sure, yeah. So just to repeat a little bit, I think. So the question is like, well, ideal state of zero isn't very practical in the enterprise. And that's 100% true. It's sort of aiming for people have no access until they need it. But it's more the thought process of like, hey, we gotta aim for like minimal access, but if people need it, it's easy. In the enterprise, it is really messy. I think, especially places like Active Directory and stuff like that, even if you have a sort of well-deployed IAM solution, it's pretty tough to manage roles and different entitlements and things like that. So I think what I would say is some of the things I'm presenting, I would still hope people try. So they're trying to make provisioning easier, and that might not even be a technology problem. It's like an approval problem or a process problem, right? Start pruning, like let people lose access, but make sure they understand if they actually need it, you can get it back quickly. So some of that will be a little bit more painful with internal systems. And to your point, like some of the companies I've met with have 6,000 internal proprietary systems that are a pain in the ass, right? But the whole point is, it's more of an approach of trying to apply some of these things, which is people get less access than we typically give. If they need more, we give them more, but we try to monitor as much as possible to reduce that. I will say some of these SaaS things are a huge pain in the butt for these companies, because if you've been around a long time, even though it's messy internally, you at least have thought about provisioning and deprovisioning and stuff across 300,000 employees or something. But now that any of them can sign up for Salesforce, all these other things, it's sort of this new world. Like I just talked to someone the other day that said, I just spent 3 years locking down corporate and I have to start over because of cloud, right? So I don't know if I'm explicitly answering your question, but I think some of the same frames of mind apply to very large, complicated, even more internally focused enterprises, where can you involve the team? Can you sponsor service accounts and contractors? Can you prune and reduce privilege? And can you, compare people to their peers and say, hey, why does this person have so much access? You would quickly find out that this person's the only one that has GitHub access, and that whole team is not in engineering, that kind of thing. So it's very much a sort of, you have to take it in steps, but I do think most of these would apply.
Hi. What about the role-based access? I mean, that was so prevalent for the longest time. I mean, do you see how that can play into how the cloud scenario can take advantage of something like that? Or
Yeah, the challenge is, so talking about role-based access and trying to put people into different roles, and this role just maps to this access and that kind of thing, I think is the question. The challenge is, even if you have things like Active Directory, you have like Salesforce or Slack or some of these other things, and I know I'm giving some of the same examples, but they want to maintain their own access rights and their own control. And there is maybe a little mapping, but usually it's not very easy to straight up map like this group has this access and that kind of thing. Plus, I think the world's more dynamic now, where even if you're in a role today, like, oh, well, you need a new project. Okay, so we're just going to give you this other role. And even if that part works, it's remembering to take that role away next week when that project's done. That doesn't happen typically, right? So I do think there's some positive, sort of value in the role-based access control, but I think it's so dynamic that there isn't really a comparison of what you have access to and what do you do. Like that feedback loop is missing.
Hey Ben, thanks a lot for your presentation. There were a lot of great stuff in there that I resonated with. I particularly like the fact that you mentioned human relationships as being useful to solving problems, as well as the engineering part. The idea and the question about roles, and I think one of the secret sauces that you put up there was automated assessment of whether it's okay to give them access, and then notify the manager. So that's the angle I've been approaching, and I think you can use roles for that. So instead of using the role as granting the entitlement, use the role as the pattern to go look at as part of the automated assessment. If they already have a role for which this is appropriate, then just provision it, right? But then take it away. And I think of, the old days, access request and approval. I think in the modern world, the way you're looking at it is interacting with the resource is the request. The assessment and the provisioning can happen right then, and you can just take it away every night. If you get to the point where you're really provisioning fast and easy and the assessment engine works, you can actually reach that zero tolerance. You just need the magic sauce of how you're going to assess and what the model is. And I think roles and assignments play a good part of that.
Yeah, thank you. No, that was a great comment.
I have a point of discussion for you.
Sure.
Curious to hear your feedback on this. I was at B-Side Seattle, and Auth made a presentation about how they do provisioning. And they do something very similar to what you're talking about. So they will do just-in-time provisioning for writing to production for their senior engineers if necessary, but they do it in conjunction with public shaming. So if an engineer gets this permission and actually uses it, it gets posted to the company-wide Slack channel.
Wow.
Which means that either that person is a hero and then everyone congratulates them because they solved some emergency that was going on in real time, or they're going to be fired tomorrow, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a very interesting social way of doing that monitoring. I'm curious to hear your perspective on that, if that's a good idea.
Yeah, I haven't thought a whole lot about the shaming part. I think the whole point is everything needs to be audited and accessible to someone, right? Like we all need that sort of secondary check. Even if you are the monitor, someone has to like monitor your access. And in fact, one of the pain points I've heard a lot is they don't know what their O365 admin or their Salesforce admin is doing. Like, is that person creating other admin accounts? Are they reading people's email? Very few security teams have visibility into that. So I think the whole idea of like, hey, if you're going to push maybe code to production or something like that, I think the fact knowing that someone is going to, or a whole group of people is going to see that, is a good way to prevent someone from like trying it out, or maybe reducing the possibility that an insider does it. There's a whole lot of deterrence. Like if you have more monitoring, it is a deterrent to insider threat usually.
Other questions? You're not getting beer until 5. It's not like if you don't have questions, like you were just going to sit here.
It is kind of hot in here though. So.
You can knock things over. All right, I think that's it.
Well, thank you everyone so much.
Round of applause.